Hey, and welcome back to Beginner's Fab. My name is Eric McGrew, and I want to introduce the second portion, I guess you could say, of the series of videos for Beginner's Fab that have to deal directly with my Daihatsu project, the 4-track Rugger Rocky F73, whatever you want to call it. And as you may know, I have been working on this truck for a while now. I started off with the Beginner's Fab series with a very basic video in the first few episodes of converting the bumper and stuff like that, which were just really my initial portions of getting into all this stuff. However, we've progressed further on to that than that, and I've really gotten more into repairing the suspension and modifying the suspension and things like that on this project. So in this episode here in particular, I'm going to go over some of the very basic concepts of what the difference I found personally in the leaf spring conversion from a SOA 3-link coil spring conversion that I did before. Now, comparing the two are not comparing quality of work done so much as processes, because the first suspension I put on this truck that was fully custom was the SOA 3-link, and I had bought the arc welder specifically for that job because the MIG welder that I had wasn't powerful enough to do the work. So I can't really compare qualities on those jobs, but I can compare the processes of doing them. And I've also learned over the time, so I'll talk a little bit about that as well. Now, with this job in particular, I have to really thank a number of people because they've been really supportive in my efforts. And in fact, the whole process of putting the leaf spring suspension on this is due really to one person in particular. So I want to thank, first off, I want to thank Carrie Sharon. I want to thank Brad Blake, all the guys over at the Isuzu forum. I know that sounds kind of weird. The Isuzu page, Isuzu Trader, that group in particular on Facebook. And also I want to thank John Kappa. John Kappa I want to thank specifically because he actually gave me the idea of doing the leaf spring on this truck. Now, the idea of doing both a leaf spring and 3-link is all my own doing, and John Kappa has no fault in that, and none of the quality of the welds or any of the fabrication work can be faulted against any of these people, because I've made those decisions basically on my own. And since I live in Chile and they all live in the States, they didn't help me do any of the actual work. So I don't want to put any of that blame on anybody else. I don't want to ruin their reputation in that sense. But they have given me a lot of help in figuring out this stuff. So now what we're going to do is actually go over to the Rocky and see a little bit about what it is that I've done to this moment, because the job is not finished, but it's a real basic process, and I can step you through it as we go along. So one of the main things I guess I should really explain about this vehicle is that originally it was not by any means leaf spring vehicle or a leaf sprung vehicle. It was originally a 4-link with standard typical style trailing arms or trailing links, whatever you want to call them. The springs were actually mounted to the trailing links themselves, and they set approximately around right here in the chassis. Now, that system caused me a few problems because of the style of area that I live, and the fact that the bushings that I needed for this were not bushings that are supported here in Chile. So over time, I had originally converted it over to a 3-link, as I mentioned earlier, and the whole idea of converting this time with a leaf spring came from John Kappa, because John's background, especially with the Jeep brand, just made sense in pickups and things like that. And he asked, well, if you need it running and you need to get it going, why not just do the simple swap, which is a leaf spring swap? And it was based on his suggestion that I actually thought about this. Now, what really came to mind with me was to do a comparison between doing a custom leaf spring conversion in comparison to doing a coil spring conversion, especially one such as what I have planned, which would be like a SOA or spring over axle, and doing a 3-link. Well, two things that needed to definitely be done to accommodate a leaf spring were that I had to change up the fact that I could no longer use a panhard or a track bar on the back of the truck. Now, that required cutting off the panhard or track bar mount on the axle and also on the suspension, on the chassis itself, because here the track bar mount was really low and it would have the potential of hitting the actual springs themselves on the leaf pack. So, as I wanted to make this a dual compatible suspension, coil and leaf, I had to come up with a design that would accommodate both. And the only way I could do that was either doing a triangulated 4-link or a triangulated 3-link, which I'll explain a little bit later. But in this series of these episodes here, we're going to talk specifically about the leaf spring suspension that I've started to apply. Now, understand, none of this is actually finalized as far as placement because right now I just have everything tacked up. And really, I would like to go over the principles that I found in applying the leaf spring suspension with this in comparison to what I had found before with the coil springs. One of the things told to me by others was that if I did a leaf spring suspension, it'd be really simple and I could get it on the truck fairly quickly without too much hassle. Now, while I would say that for a beginner, any kind of suspension is a little bit complicated, from my experience, the leaf spring suspension was a lot easier to apply to the truck than a coil spring suspension, especially if it's a custom coil spring suspension. In my case, I went through a couple of scenarios to try to figure out what it was that was going on with this truck, and then I had to decide from there how I wanted to do it. The great thing about leaf spring suspensions that I found is that there are multiple things you can do to adjust your ride height. You can build different shackle lengths, whether they be shorter or longer. Typically, you don't want any shorter than around 2.5 inches between center on the bolt holes on the shackle, but you can go up to as long as probably around 8 inches and it work. More than that is getting a little extreme, and I don't know that I would really suggest it, and most others haven't been willing to suggest that to me either. And the other thing is that you can always add or take out leaves. You can even, under extreme circumstances, change the leaf pack. Now, one thing that I did appreciate about leaves, at least being here in Chile, is that I could find used leaf packs for different kinds of vehicles at different lengths and things like that, at different weights, for fairly cheap in comparison to actual coil spring setups. So that was definitely a benefit to me for the leaf spring setup. One thing though that I did find a little bit of a challenge was trying to figure out how to actually measure out the distance between the shackle and the pivot mount brackets to make sure that my shackle angles weren't too extreme either vertically or laid back in a positive, negative, I guess you could say, degree of angle. Now, that's important because if your shackles are too vertical when you actually have the springs under normal load, just the resting weight of the vehicle, it'll do two things for you. One is that it'll make the ride really stiff, and two, when the springs actually go into droop, pulling on the axle, pulling the weight down, that arc gets so increased, it makes such a U that it can actually pull the shackles reversed, and then you can actually break leafs in that form. At the same time though, if you have your shackles too far back under the standing weight of the chassis and the body of the vehicle, then your shackles can't swing out enough to make for adjustment of the flattening of the springs as they come into compression, and that also could cause breakage or make it a really, really uncomfortable ride. So there is still geometry that you have to take into consideration for the springs themselves. Another thing is that if you take too many leaves out of the pack to lower the ride height, you have to worry about two factors, which are compression of the springs, which will flatten them out and then make them basically unusable, to the point to where they could actually go negative arc, or arch, not arc, arch. And that way you will actually be running on a spring that gives you no spring at all. And then the other factor, of course, is considering the fact that the leaf packs can allow for what you call axle warp under the torque of the transmission and the driveline, adding that spinning power with the resistance of the ground. The differential pinion will try to go either upward or downward based on that torque. Well, if you have too few spring packs, even though it allows your truck to sit at the right height that you want, that movement in the axle will actually create a warpage that can damage the springs themselves. So if you're going to run lesser springs, you may have to consider an anti-warp bar. What this will do for you is it'll allow you to continue to have the articulation and the soft ride that you want, but the anti-warp bar will not allow the pivot angle of the differential to move too drastically upward or downward, causing damage to either your shocks or your leaf spring packets themselves, or the U-joints and the actual ring and pinion inside the differential. So you do have to keep that in mind as well. Another factor to consider is that they're easier to adjust height and lowering rates on the springs without taking out leaves of the leaf pack, because you can build higher or lower lift blocks, or spring perches, I guess is what you really should call them, because lift blocks are different. So if you needed to drop the ride height in the back of the vehicle in this case, you could put it spring under axle, or SUA as a lot of people call it, and that would drop your ride height instantly. But you could also add a taller spring perch that would actually bring it down a few more inches on the bottom side, and that would level out your ride height in the rear as well. On the opposite side, if you wanted to lift the truck, you could put spring perches on top of the axle, which is a SOA, or spring over axle, and that way you would gain height, plus you could actually lift those a little bit and give you the height that you want. Lift blocks are another option, but we're not going to get into that today because I'm not a proponent of those under most circumstances, and that isn't really related to what I'm dealing with the vehicle at the moment. So what did it take for me to get a custom leaf spring suspension put together? Well, let's talk about it. I really hope you guys come back to see the rest of my videos. I'm really happy that you stopped by, so please don't forget to keep on visiting beginnersfab.com. You can also check out all my YouTube videos through this same video on below, or the channel in which this is placed. I also have playlists that you can check out. And please don't forget to check out my offroadindependence.com site, where I have all of my off-road podcasts that I do with different individuals who like off-roading, some of them more famous, some of them less famous, but the content is always interesting because we're getting real-life perspectives of off-roading. Also, if you want to see some of my adventures and different things that I have going on, you can definitely check me out at ericmcgrew.tv, where you will find all of this content, and you can look me up on Facebook as well, facebook.com/groups/beginnersfab, or you can just look under this video in the information on YouTube, and there you can find more links to get to all of my sites that you might want to see. So once again, thanks for stopping by, and I hope to see you in the next video.